The long winter had settled deeply over the land. Snow no longer fell with the restless urgency of earlier weeks. Instead, it lay quietly across the slopes and fields, pressed into gentle curves by its own weight, smoothing the rough edges of rock and timber alike. The sky above the fjord held a pale, dim light that never seemed to brighten fully, as though the sun had grown tired of rising high over the cold horizon. Air moved slowly across the frozen ground, thin and dry, carrying little sound with it. Even the distant water seemed subdued beneath the season, its surface dark and steady between shelves of ice that clung to the shoreline. Not much stirred in such weather. Paths that had once been marked by boots and sled runners were now softened by drifting snow. The forest stood silent along the hills, its branches stiff with frost, its needles dusted white. Somewhere beneath that quiet cover lay fields and grazing ground that would not appear again for many months. Winter had its own pace here. Days shortened until they felt almost like long evenings, and nights stretched across the land with patient certainty. The people who lived along these coasts had long ago learned to shape their lives around that rhythm. Work moved indoors, voices grew softer, movement slowed. Inside the timber walls of the longhouse, the air carried a different kind of stillness. The thick planks of the structure held the warmth of the hearth within them, though the heat never spread far. Near the center of the room, the fire glowed in a bed of embers, its light low and steady, painting the beams above with a faint amber shimmer. Smoke drifted upward through the opening in the roof, curling slowly into the dimness. Around the edges of the hall, the darker parts of the room remained quiet and watchful. Wooden chests rested along the walls, their lids worn smooth by years of use. Hooks and beams overhead supported rows of hanging provisions that had been prepared months earlier, when autumn winds were still moving across the coast and the sea had not yet begun to freeze along its edges. Fish split and dried in the open air, thin strips of meat cured with salt, bundles of herbs tied carefully together with twine. Each one had been placed there with the same simple purpose, to carry the household through the long cold season. The smells of those stores had become part of the longhouse itself, a faint sharpness of salt, the dry, quiet scent of preserved fish, the earthy weight of grain resting in woven sacks. None of it was strong, yet together they formed a familiar presence in the dim interior. Even in silence, the room felt full of quiet preparations made long ago. Near one of the storage chests, the man moved slowly across the packed earthen floor. His steps were unhurried, the thick wool of his clothing brushing lightly against the bench as he passed. The air inside the longhouse carried just enough warmth to soften the stiffness that cold left in the body, though his fingers still held the memory of the winter air outside. He paused beside the chest. For a moment he simply rested his hand against the lid, feeling the rough grain of the wood beneath his palm. The chest had been opened many times since the snow first settled across the land, though never carelessly. Each visit had followed the quiet rhythm of the season: small meals, steady habits, careful use of what had been gathered earlier in the year. Nothing about the moment seemed unusual. The long house remained calm around him. The fire gave a small sound as a coal shifted deeper into the embers. Above him, the rows of preserved fish hung unmoving in the still air. He bent slightly and lifted the lid, The hinges answered with a soft wooden creak, the sound barely rising above the low breathing of the fire. Inside the chest lay the winter stores that had been portioned carefully when autumn work was finished. Bundles of dried fish wrapped in cloth, small cuts of cured meat resting beside them, a few sacks of grain tucked neatly along the side where the wood curved inward, all of it familiar, all of it expected. He leaned closer, his hand resting against the edge of the chest as his eyes moved slowly across the contents. The bundles looked much the same as they always had. The cloth wrappings were tied in the same careful knots. The pieces of fish still carried the pale, dry sheen of the sea wind that had hardened them months earlier. Yet something about the space inside the chest felt slightly different tonight. Not empty, not alarming, just a little more open than before. The winter still had many weeks ahead of it. The lid of the chest remained open before him. For a while he did not move at all. His hand rested along the edge of the wood where the grain had been worn smooth by many winters of the same careful motion. The dim light from the hearth reached only part way into the chest, touching the pale surfaces of wrapped bundles and leaving the deeper corners in shadow. His eyes adjusted slowly. What lay inside was familiar enough that he did not need to examine each item closely to recognize it. The shape of every bundle had been known to him since the early autumn days when they had been tied and placed there. Each piece of preserved fish had been hung, dried, folded, and wrapped with quiet intention. Nothing had ever been placed inside without thought. That was the way of preparing for winter. Long before the snow had reached the hills, the work had already begun. While the winds still moved freely across the coast and the sea remained open between the fjords, the people along these shores had filled their days with the careful business of storing food. He could still remember the dry autumn air that had carried the smell of salt along the shore. Fish had been brought in from the cold water, split along the spine and stretched across wooden frames where the wind could reach them. The long northern air had done the rest, pulling the moisture slowly from the flesh until the fish hardened into the pale, stiff shapes that would last through the season. The process required patience more than effort. Nothing about it could be hurried. The fish needed time, days and sometimes weeks, hanging beneath the open sky while wind and cold air passed steadily over them. If rain came, they were moved beneath shelter. If the air grew too still, they were shifted to where the breeze might reach again. He had walked among those frames many times, hands checking the firmness of the flesh, eyes measuring the pale color that told when the drying was complete. The finished fish had been carried into the longhouse one bundle at a time. Some were hung high along the beams where air could still move around them. Others were wrapped and laid carefully inside chests like the one before him now. The smell of them had filled the longhouse during those early winter days, sharp and dry, like sea wind that had been trapped inside wood. Beside the fish inside the chest lay smaller pieces of cured meat. Those had followed a different path before reaching this place. Meat was treated with salt and hung close to the smoke where the slow breath of the hearth hardened its surface. Over time, the moisture left it as well, leaving strips that could be kept for months if they were protected from damp air. He lifted one of the bundles gently. The cloth wrapping felt stiff beneath his fingers. its surface holding the faint powder of dried salt that had escaped from the meat within. He turned it slightly in his hands, weighing it without really needing to. It was lighter than it had once been. Of course it was. Winter had been unfolding steadily for many weeks now. Meals had been taken each evening, sometimes small, sometimes a little larger, when the cold had pressed harder against the longhouse walls. Nothing unusual had been done with the stores, nothing careless. Yet the season had its own quiet arithmetic. He lowered the bundle back into its place. The sound it made against the bottom of the chest was soft and dull, cloth brushing against wood, a sound that barely disturbed the stillness of the room. Above him the beams held their quiet rows of hanging provisions. He straightened slowly and turned his head upward, following the lines of the rafters with his eyes. Several fish hung there in narrow clusters, their long bodies stiff and slightly curved where the drying wind had shaped them. Twine loops held them securely along the beam, spaced so that air could move between them. They did not sway. The air inside the long house was too still for that. He rose from his kneeling position and took a few slow steps across the packed earth floor. His boots made almost no sound, the surface beneath them worn smooth by the steady movement of many winters. When he reached the wall, he lifted one hand toward the nearest bundle of fish. The flesh felt dry and rigid beneath his fingers. The outer surface carried a faint roughness where salt crystals had gathered during the curing. He pressed lightly along the side, testing the firmness the same way he had done months earlier when the fish first came inside. It had kept well. The northern air had done its work. He let the fish settle back against the beam. The long house remained quiet behind him. The fire shifted once, sending a small glow across the timber posts before returning again to its low, steady breathing. For a while he moved slowly along the wall, touching one bundle and then another. The actions were small and unhurried, more like recognition than inspection. Each item had been seen many times already during the winter weeks, yet tonight he allowed his hands to linger slightly longer than before. At the far end of the storage area, another chest sat close against the wall. He knelt beside it and lifted its lid as well. Inside were sacks of grain, barley mostly, some oats mixed among them. The woven cloth of the sacks had darkened where hands had handled them during the season, though the knots remained tight and well tied. He loosened one just enough to reach inside. The grain slipped between his fingers in a slow, dry stream. Each kernel carried the faint warmth that grain holds even in cold rooms, as if remembering the sun that had once ripened it in the fields. He let the barley fall back into the sack and drew the cloth closed again. Grain was different from fish and meat. It did not hang in view along the beams. It remained hidden inside sacks and chests, used in quiet handfuls across many weeks. Because of that, it was often harder to sense how much remained without looking closely. He sat back slightly on his heels. The open chest rested before him, its contents simple and orderly. None of the stores appeared disturbed. Nothing had been misplaced or forgotten. Everything remained arranged with the same care that had been given at the start of the winter. Yet the spaces between the bundles were easier to see now. Where cloth once pressed against cloth, small gaps had begun to appear. The chest did not look empty, but it looked used. He closed the lid slowly and rested his palm on the wood again. Above him, the rafters held their rows of fish in patient silence. The sacks of grain sat quietly in their corners. The longhouse walls carried the familiar smells of dried food that had become part of the room itself. The winter outside had many weeks still waiting beyond the hills. He remained kneeling beside the chest, his breathing slow and steady, letting the quiet interior settle again around him while his thoughts moved toward the simple question that always followed such moments: how long the stores would need to last, and how they might be measured from here. He remained kneeling beside the chest for some time after closing the lid. The long house did not hurry him. Nothing in the room asked for quick movement. The quiet that lived inside these timber walls encouraged slower habits, especially during the long winter weeks when the hours stretched out and the work of the outside world waited patiently beneath snow. His hand still rested against the lid of the chest. The wood had a faint coolness to it now. Earlier in the season, the stored food inside would have given the chest a slightly different weight and warmth, but winter had slowly drawn those differences away as the stores were used little by little. He shifted his position and lowered himself onto the bench beside the wall. From there he could see both the closed chest and the beams above where the preserved fish hung. The faint light from the hearth reached them unevenly, leaving the far ends of the rafters in shadow, while the nearer bundles carried a dull pale glow. He did not count them immediately. Instead, he let his eyes rest on the lines of the room. The roof beams crossed above him like dark ribs beneath the thatch. Between them, the smoke hole allowed a thin column of gray air to slip upward into the fading daylight outside. The slow breath of the fire below kept the air moving just enough to keep the smoke drifting. Somewhere along the far wall, a piece of timber made a quiet settling sound. Wood always did that in winter. When the cold tightened its hold on the outside of the longhouse, the thick planks would shift slightly against their joints. The sounds were small, soft creaks that came and went without pattern, but they had become part of the winter silence in the same way as the low sound of the fire. He leaned forward and reached for the chest again. This time he did not open it immediately. Instead, he rested both hands along the edges of the lid and closed his eyes for a moment, letting his thoughts move back through the weeks that had already passed. The beginning of winter had never arrived all at once. First, there had been frost on the ground in the mornings. Then the grass along the fields had begun to stiffen beneath the boots of those who walked across it. Only later had the snow come, settling quietly over the hills and slowly deepening as the weeks continued. Each part of that change had carried its own rhythm. When the snow first came, the chests had been full, fish stacked close together inside cloth wrappings, meat bundles placed tightly beside one another, grain sacks still heavy enough that they needed two hands to move. During those early winter days, there had been no reason to think about how much remained. Meals were taken in the evenings without careful measurement. A piece of fish might be chosen simply because it hung closest to reach. A handful of barley might be poured into the pot without much attention to the depth of the sack afterward. The season had felt long then, long enough that the stores seemed more than sufficient. But winter did not pass in large pieces. It moved in small portions of time, one evening meal after another, one morning where the snow outside appeared unchanged, one quiet day where little happened beyond the steady breathing of the fire and the occasional movement inside the longhouse. Over time, those small portions accumulated. He opened the chest again. The lid rose slowly under his hands, its hinges answering with the same low wooden sound as before. The interior revealed itself once more beneath the dim hearth light. This time his eyes moved more deliberately. He lifted one bundle of fish and set it aside on the bench beside him. Then another. He placed them in a row along the wood, spacing them slightly so he could see each one clearly. Their shapes were familiar. Some were long and narrow, others shorter where the fish had been smaller when dried. The cloth wrappings were tied with the same knots he had used when placing them there at the beginning of the season. He did not untie them. There was no need. The weight alone told him enough. He arranged the bundles into a small group on the bench. Then he reached again into the chest and drew out the meat packages, laying them beside the fish in their own quiet row. When the chest had been full earlier in the winter, removing this many bundles would have left only a shallow hollow among the remaining stores. Now the space inside appeared larger. The bottom of the chest showed through more clearly than before. He leaned slightly closer and studied what remained. A few bundles still rested along the sides. One or two pieces had been placed deeper in the corner where the wood curved inward. The arrangement had not changed since the autumn days when the stores were first organized. What had changed was simply how much of it had already been used. He reached toward the beam above and untied one of the hanging fish. The twine slipped free easily, the knot loosened by repeated handling over the weeks. The fish itself felt stiff and dry in his hands, its long body holding the pale color of something that had spent many days beneath open sky before the cold truly arrived. He brought it down and laid it across the bench beside the other bundles. For a moment he looked at the small collection now gathered there: fish, meat, the quiet remains of the work that had once filled the autumn days. None of it seemed dangerously low. There was still enough to see clearly, enough to hold in both hands. Yet the mind had its own way of measuring such things. He began counting slowly, not with numbers spoken aloud, but with the quiet rhythm of moving each bundle slightly to one side as he noted it. One piece here, another there, a small cluster placed together where his hand had already passed. When he finished, he rested both palms against the bench. The amount remaining would carry the household forward. That much was certain, but winter did not always move exactly as expected. Some years the cold lingered longer across the fjord. Snow remained on the hills beyond the usual time. The sea held its ice along the shore weeks beyond the point when boats normally returned to the water. Such winters were not rare. They were simply part of living in this land. He lifted one of the smaller bundles and turned it slowly in his hands. The cloth felt rough against his fingers. When he set it back down, he did so with a little more care than before. His gaze drifted toward the grain chest across the room. Grain lasted differently. It could stretch across many meals if it was used carefully. A small handful added to a pot of water could grow into something larger than its first appearance suggested. Fish and meat did not change like that. Their portions remained exactly what they were. He gathered the bundles from the bench and returned them to the chest, placing them again in neat rows against the sides. The movements were steady and deliberate. When he finished, he closed the lid once more. The room felt the same as it had earlier. The fire still breathed quietly in the center of the longhouse. The rafters held their silent rows of food above. The sacks of grain rested patiently in the other chest. Nothing had changed, yet his thoughts had settled into a different shape now. He remained seated on the bench, looking at the closed lid before him. The winter weeks ahead would continue to pass one evening at a time. Meals would still be taken beside the hearth, but the portions within the chest might need to move more carefully from here, not because the stores were gone, only because the season was patient, and it still had a long distance left to travel. After a while he rose from the bench. The small group of bundles he had counted now rested again inside the chest, arranged much as they had been before. The lid lay closed beneath his palm for a moment, the wood steady and unmoving as the quiet of the long house settled once more around him. Nothing in the room had changed. The beams still held their silent rows of hanging fish. The sacks of grain remained where they had always rested along the wall. The fire in the center of the hall breathed softly, its embers shifting with the slow patience that belonged to long winter evenings. Yet the small awareness that had come while he sat counting remained with him. It did not press or hurry him, it simply stayed. He turned from the chest and moved toward the low table near the hearth. The warmth there was faint but noticeable after kneeling beside the colder wall. His hands felt it first, the stiff fingers easing slightly as he placed them against the edge of the table. The surface carried the marks of many meals, knife lines faintly cut into the wood, darkened patches where bowls had rested over the years, a quiet history of small daily movements repeated through many winters. He stood there for a moment, listening to the low breathing of the fire. Then he returned to the chest once more and lifted the lid again. The bundles inside remained exactly as he had arranged them. His hand hovered briefly above them before selecting one piece of dried fish. The cloth wrapping slid easily from its place, the bundle light in his grip as he carried it across the room toward the table. He untied the knot carefully. The cloth loosened in a slow circle, revealing the pale length of fish inside. Its surface had hardened during the long days of drying months earlier, the flesh drawn tight by salt and cold air. He laid it flat against the table. Beside the fish rested a small knife. The blade had been sharpened many times, its edge thin and steady, the handle worn smooth where fingers had gripped it during years of work. He picked it up and tested its balance for a moment before lowering the blade toward the fish. The first cut came slowly. The knife pressed through the stiff flesh with a quiet resistance, the blade moving carefully along the grain of the dried meat. A thin strip separated and curled slightly as he lifted it away. He set that piece aside. Normally, the evening meal might have begun with a slightly larger portion, one cut taken freely from the fish, perhaps another if the cold had been heavy that day. The stores had allowed for such small comfort earlier in the winter. Tonight his movements remained more measured. The second slice was narrower. He drew the knife along the surface again, separating another thin strip that he placed beside the first. The pieces lay pale against the dark wood of the table, their edges slightly rough where the dried fibers had parted beneath the blade. He paused there. The fish remained mostly whole. The two slices resting beside it were small enough that the larger piece could still be wrapped again and returned to the chest without much change to its shape. He rested the knife down beside them. The decision required no words. He simply looked at the pieces for a moment, weighing them in the quiet way people often measure such things, by sight, by habit, by the quiet sense of what a meal should be. Then he lifted the larger portion of fish and wrapped it again in its cloth. The knot closed easily beneath his fingers. When he returned it to the chest, the bundle slipped neatly back into its place among the others. The lid lowered slowly. Back at the table, the two thin strips remained where he had left them. He sat down on the bench beside the hearth and pulled the table slightly closer. The warmth of the fire reached the fish now, softening the dry smell of salt that rose faintly from its surface. From the grain chest he brought a small wooden scoop. The barley sack loosened with a quiet pull of the cord. He reached inside and lifted a modest handful of the pale kernels, letting them fall into a small bowl beside the fish. The sound they made was soft, grain brushing against wood, a dry whisper that disappeared almost as soon as it was heard. He tied the sack again and carried the bowl back to the hearth. A small pot rested nearby. Water already waited inside it, cool and still from earlier in the day. He added the barley slowly, the grain slipping into the surface with a gentle ripple before settling at the bottom. The fish strips he placed beside the pot for the moment. They would soften later once the water warmed enough to draw some life back into the dried flesh. For now the meal remained simple. He settled back slightly on the bench, watching the pot as the first small movements began inside it. The heat from the embers reached upward through the metal, encouraging the water to stir almost invisibly. Outside the longhouse, the winter evening deepened quietly. Inside, the work of the meal moved at its own patient pace. Nothing about the food before him suggested urgency or lack. There was still fish hanging above the beams, still grain inside the sacks, still bundles resting within the chest. But the portions prepared this evening had taken on a slightly different shape than before, not smaller in a way that could be called severe, only careful. The barley would swell as it warmed. The thin strips of fish would soften and spread their salt into the water. Together they would form a meal that could carry him easily through the quiet hours of the night. He watched the pot as a few small bubbles finally rose to the surface and slipped quietly away. The knife still rested on the table behind him. The chest along the wall remained closed, and the small changes in how the food moved from one place to another, chest to table, table to pot, settled gently into the quiet rhythm of the evening. The pot warmed slowly beside the hearth. Nothing inside it moved quickly. The water held its heat close, releasing it little by little into the barley that rested beneath the surface. A few small bubbles appeared along the bottom of the pot, rising in patient intervals before disappearing against the quiet air above. He leaned forward slightly on the bench, resting his forearms against his knees. The warmth from the hearth reached his hands first. It crept slowly into the stiff joints of his fingers, easing the lingering chill that had followed him in from the outer part of the longhouse. The sensation was familiar. Winter warmth never rushed. It only arrived gradually, spreading through the body in careful stages. He watched the pot for a while. The barley had begun to swell now, each grain taking on water and softening in the slow heat. The thin strips of dried fish he had cut earlier rested beside the pot on the table, their pale surfaces still stiff but beginning to gather a faint moisture from the air near the hearth. The smell of the fish had grown slightly stronger, not unpleasant, just noticeable. It mixed with the faint scent of grain warming in the pot and the dry breath of smoke drifting above the fire. He reached for the fish strips and lowered them gently into the water. The dried flesh resisted the heat at first, floating near the surface before slowly beginning to soften. The fibers loosened little by little as the warmth worked through them. He nudged them slightly with a wooden spoon. The movement was slow and careful, not stirring so much as guiding the pieces deeper into the barley where the heat was stronger. Once they settled, he placed the spoon back on the table. The meal would take time. That was always the way with grain. Unlike fresh meat or fish, barley did not change quickly when placed near the fire. It absorbed warmth gradually, expanding and thickening as it did so. The patience required for such cooking had long ago become part of winter evenings. While the pot worked quietly beside the hearth, other small tasks could be done. He rose again from the bench and returned to the storage chest along the wall. The lid lifted once more beneath his hands. Inside, the bundles rested exactly as he had arranged them earlier. The cloth wrappings sat in orderly rows, their shapes forming small quiet ridges against the wooden base of the chest. He did not remove any of them this time. Instead, he shifted a few slightly. One bundle moved closer to the corner where the wood curved inward. Another slid forward so that its edge aligned more neatly with the others. These movements did not change the amount of food within the chest, but they changed how the space inside it appeared. When the bundles were placed closer together, the open gaps between them became less noticeable. The rows looked fuller, their shapes pressing gently against one another in a way that reminded him of the early winter days when the chest had first been filled. He rested his hand briefly against the cloth of one bundle. It was firm and dry beneath his fingers. That was important. If the preserved food ever grew soft with damp air, it would begin to spoil. Winter cold protected the stores in many ways, but moisture remained a constant enemy inside any longhouse. He lifted one bundle slightly and checked the cloth beneath it. The wood of the chest remained dry. Satisfied, he lowered the bundle back into its place. These small checks had become quiet habits over the years. Even when the stores were plentiful, the chest was never simply left alone. A careful household watched its winter food the way a shepherd watched animals grazing along the hills, without urgency, but with steady attention. He closed the lid again. When he turned back toward the hearth, the pot had begun to thicken. Steam rose in faint threads above the surface now. The barley had expanded enough that the water no longer looked clear. Instead, it held a cloudy softness where the grain had released its starch. He sat again on the bench and leaned closer. The spoon returned to his hand. This time he stirred gently. The motion brought the softened fish pieces up from the bottom of the pot, revealing how the heat had begun to change them. Their stiff edges had relaxed, the pale flesh separating slightly where the fibers had once held tightly together. Salt from the fish spread slowly through the barley. The smell rising from the pot deepened with it. Not strong, but steady, a meal forming. He let the spoon rest again. For a moment he studied the small amount inside the pot. It was enough. Once the barley finished swelling, the volume would grow slightly. Grain had a way of filling a bowl more generously than it first appeared. Still, he could not help noticing how different the preparation had been tonight. Earlier in the winter, the fish might have been cut into thicker portions. Sometimes a second strip might have been added without much thought. The pot might have been filled slightly higher with grain. None of those choices had seemed careless at the time. They had simply followed the easy comfort of full stores. Now the movements of his hands had grown more deliberate. The knife had cut thinner. The grain scoop had paused sooner. Even the fish returned to the chest had been wrapped again more tightly than before. These were not large changes, but winter was made of small decisions. The pot continued its quiet work beside the fire. He reached behind him for a wooden bowl and placed it on the table. The smooth rim caught the warm glow from the hearth as he waited for the barley to soften fully. Outside, the evening had settled across the land. Inside the longhouse, the chest remained closed along the wall, and the quiet adjustments of the evening meal continued slowly, almost unnoticed, within the steady rhythm of the winter night. The barley thickened slowly. He stirred the pot once more, drawing the spoon along the bottom so the grain would not settle too heavily against the warm metal. The movement brought the softened fish pieces upward again, their pale flesh now loosened enough to blend gently among the swelling barley. Steam rose more steadily now. It drifted upward into the dim air above the hearth, carrying with it the mild scent of grain and the sharper trace of salt released from the fish. The smell was simple and familiar, something that had accompanied many evenings through the season. He leaned slightly closer, watching the surface of the pot. Small bubbles formed beneath the grain and slipped quietly through the thick mixture before disappearing. The movement was slow and patient, like the breathing of the fire beneath it. After a moment, he set the spoon down. The meal would soon be ready. He reached for the bowl resting on the table and brought it closer. The wood felt warm beneath his fingers where it had been sitting near the hearth. Its surface held the faint smoothness that comes from years of handling, small marks from knives, darkened patches from past meals. When the barley had softened enough, he lifted the pot carefully and tipped its contents into the bowl. The thick mixture slid slowly over the rim, filling the bowl with a pale mound of barley threaded with softened pieces of fish. Steam rose immediately from the surface. the warmth brushing lightly against his face. He placed the pot aside. For a moment he simply looked at the food before him. It was not a large portion, but it held the quiet fullness that grain often carried once it had taken in water. The fish pieces rested among the barley like pale threads, their salt already worked through the mixture. He lifted the spoon again and took a slow mouthful. The heat of the food spread through his mouth first, followed by the simple taste of grain and sea salt. The fish had softened enough that it broke apart easily beneath the spoon, its flavor blending gently into the barley. He swallowed and paused. The warmth moved downward into his chest, easing the faint chill that winter often left behind after a day spent in cold air or near the draftier parts of the longhouse. Another spoonful followed. He ate slowly. There was no hurry to finish the bowl. Winter evenings allowed time for such quiet pacing, especially when the meal itself carried enough warmth to encourage patience. The fire beside him shifted slightly, sending a brief glow across the floor before settling again into its steady rhythm. Between mouthfuls, his gaze moved occasionally toward the storage chest along the wall. It remained closed. Nothing about it suggested change. The lid rested firmly against its frame, the wood quiet and still in the dim light of the room. Above it, the hanging fish remained untouched, their shapes outlined faintly against the darker beams of the roof. There was still food, still enough to see clearly, yet the small adjustments made earlier in the evening had begun to settle into his thinking. The thin slices cut from the fish, the modest scoop of barley, the careful return of the remaining portion to the chest. These were the kinds of choices that slowly shaped the length of winter stores. He took another spoonful and let the warmth linger before swallowing. Grain had always been the food that allowed winter meals to stretch farther. A small amount could grow into something satisfying once it absorbed water and heat. Even a modest scoop from the sack could fill a bowl once the barley softened and swelled. Fish and meat were different. Their portions remained what they were, but together, grain and preserved fish balanced one another well. The barley filled the bowl, while the fish carried enough salt and flavor to make the meal satisfying. He finished the bowl gradually, scraping the last of the thick barley from its sides. When it was empty, he rested the spoon inside and sat quietly for a moment. The warmth of the meal spread slowly through his body, easing the stiffness in his shoulders and back that had gathered during the colder hours of the day. The pot beside the hearth still held a thin coating of barley along its bottom. He poured a little water into it and set it near the embers again so the residue would loosen. Later it could be rinsed easily without wasting the small bits of grain that clung to the metal. Nothing in winter was discarded carelessly. Even the smallest remnants were used when possible. He leaned back slightly on the bench, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The quiet of the long house surrounded him again. The fire breathed steadily. The beams held their silent rows of fish above. The storage chest waited along the wall, its bundles arranged carefully inside. The meal had been modest, but it had carried warmth enough to settle the body. and the quiet adjustments made that evening, small changes in how the food moved from chest to table, from knife to pot, had begun to shape themselves into a simple understanding. The winter ahead would be met the same way the evening meal had been prepared, with steady hands and careful portions. For a while after the bowl was empty, he remained seated beside the hearth. The warmth of the meal moved slowly through his body, spreading outward from his chest and into his shoulders and arms. Winter cold often lingered in the joints even after food had been taken, but the steady heat of the barley and fish worked gradually against it. The bowl rested loosely in his hands. A faint trace of steam still rose from its surface, though most of the warmth had already begun to fade into the air of the room. He set the bowl aside on the table and reached for the pot he had left near the embers. The water inside had loosened the remaining barley that clung to its bottom. With a few quiet movements of the spoon, the softened grain lifted free from the metal and swirled gently in the cloudy water. He tipped the mixture into the bowl and drank it slowly. It was thin and nearly tasteless now, but it carried warmth and the faint residue of salt that remained from the fish. Nothing of the meal was wasted if it could still be taken in such a way. When the bowl was empty again, he wiped its rim with the edge of a cloth and placed it back on the table. The longhouse had grown quieter as the evening deepened. Outside, the last traces of pale winter light had faded from the sky. The dimness within the hall now belonged entirely to the hearth and the small lamps that hung along the beams. Their glow did not reach every corner. Along the walls, shadows gathered between the chests and benches where the firelight could not quite reach. The hanging fish above cast long, narrow shapes across the beams, their outlines shifting faintly as the fire moved. He stood and stretched his back slightly. The movement was slow, careful, easing the stiffness that often settled into the body after sitting too long in winter cold. His shoulders rolled once beneath the heavy wool of his tunic before settling again into a comfortable stillness. Then he turned toward the grain chest. The lid opened with the same quiet creak it had given earlier. Inside, the sacks of barley rested in their orderly row, their cloth surfaces darkened where hands had handled them through the season. He lifted one sack and carried it to the table. The knot loosened beneath his fingers. When he opened the cloth and reached inside, the barley felt dry and firm as it slipped through his hand. The kernels made a soft rustling sound against one another, a quiet whisper of grain shifting inside the sack. He did not take much, only a small scoop that he set aside in a shallow wooden dish. The rest he returned to the sack before tightening the knot again and placing it carefully back inside the chest. The small dish of barley remained on the table. He looked at it for a moment before moving toward the wall where several bundles of dried herbs hung beside the fish. Their leaves had curled inward during the long weeks of drying, forming dark, fragile clusters along the twine that held them together. He selected a small bundle and brought it to the table. With his fingers, he rubbed a few leaves loose into the dish of barley. The dried herbs crumbled easily, releasing a faint, earthy scent as they mixed with the grain. The smell was subtle but welcome, something that would add a quiet depth to the next pot of barley when it was cooked. He stirred the mixture lightly with his fingertips. The herbs spread among the pale kernels in thin dark threads. When he finished, he set the dish aside near the hearth, where it would be ready for the next meal. This had become one of the quiet ways winter food was stretched. The grain itself remained the same, but the herbs carried flavor that allowed smaller portions of fish or meat to feel more complete when they were added to the pot. Such small additions made little difference on their own, but over many evenings they softened the need for larger pieces of preserved food. He returned the remaining herb bundle to its place along the beam and brushed the dust of dried leaves from his hands. The longhouse air carried the faint scent now, grain, smoke, and the light bitterness of crushed herbs mingling together near the warmth of the hearth. He moved back toward the storage chest. The lid remained closed just as before. For a moment he rested his hand against it again, feeling the solid weight of the wood beneath his palm. The stores inside had not changed since he last arranged them, yet the evening had already begun to shape how they would be used in the days ahead. Smaller slices, grain used more often, herbs added where once only fish might have been enough. These were not difficult adjustments. They were simply part of the quiet thinking that winter encouraged. He stepped away from the chest and returned to the bench beside the hearth. The small dish of barley and herbs rested nearby, ready for the next time the pot would be set above the embers. Above him the beams held their silent rows of fish. The sacks of grain waited patiently within the chest, and the long winter night settled gently over the longhouse as the small preparations of the evening came to rest within the slow rhythm of the season. The warmth from the hearth settled gradually through the longhouse. He remained seated on the bench, the quiet of the evening gathering around him in layers that felt deeper than earlier in the day. The small dish of barley mixed with herbs rested near the edge of the table where he had placed it. The crushed leaves had darkened the pale grain slightly. Thin threads of green and brown scattered among the kernels. Nothing about the room felt hurried now. The meal had been taken, the pot had been rinsed and set aside. The remaining warmth of the fire worked slowly against the creeping cold that always tried to return once the sun had fallen completely from the winter sky. He leaned forward and adjusted the pot slightly closer to the embers so the last thin water inside it would dry. The movement was small, careful. Metal against stone made a faint sound before settling again into stillness. Then he returned to his place on the bench. For a time he simply sat with his hands resting loosely together, watching the slow breathing of the hearth. The embers shifted quietly, releasing a dim glow that spread across the floor and climbed the lower parts of the timber posts. Above that light, the longhouse faded quickly into shadow. The beams overhead held their rows of hanging provisions, their shapes only faintly visible now where the firelight reached them. In the dimness they appeared almost stiller than before, quiet silhouettes suspended in the warm air beneath the roof. His gaze lingered there briefly. Those stores would remain untouched tonight. The meal had been taken already, and the careful adjustments made earlier in the evening had left the chest and rafters unchanged for the hours ahead. Winter nights did not ask for much more once the evening food had settled into the body. The quiet time that followed belonged mostly to stillness. He shifted slightly on the bench, stretching one leg forward and then the other. The movement eased a small stiffness in his knees that had gathered while sitting close to the hearth. The warmth from the meal continued to work through him. It softened the lingering cold that had followed him earlier from the outer parts of the longhouse where the air never fully lost its winter edge. The barley had settled well, its steady warmth spreading through his stomach and chest. Grain always did that. Fish alone filled the body differently, bringing strength but leaving the cold closer to the surface. Barley carried heat deeper, especially when eaten slowly beside the hearth. He drew the small dish of herb mixed grain closer and studied it briefly. The kernels rested loosely in the shallow wood, dry again after the brief warmth they had felt near the fire. The crushed leaves lay among them like scattered shadows. It was not much, but it would change the next pot of barley slightly when it was cooked. The herbs would soften in the water, releasing their faint bitterness into the grain. That small difference would allow a thinner strip of fish to flavor the meal just as well. He set the dish back where it had been. Nothing else needed to be done with it tonight. The longhouse continued settling into its nighttime rhythm. Somewhere along the wall, the wood gave a faint creak as the cold outside tightened against the timber. The sound was brief and familiar, no louder than the shifting of the embers. He listened to it without turning his head. Such sounds came often during deep winter. The longhouse breathed slowly as the temperature outside moved lower through the night, the thick boards adjusting slightly where they joined together. He leaned back against the wall behind the bench. The timber there held a cool firmness against his shoulders, though the warmth of the fire softened it somewhat. The position allowed him to look easily across the interior of the hall. The storage chest rested where he had left it earlier. Its lid remained closed, the iron fittings catching a faint reflection of the firelight. Above it, the hanging fish formed their quiet rows along the beam. The grain chest stood nearby, its sacks undisturbed since he had taken the small scoop of barley earlier. Everything remained orderly. Winter food often required such steadiness. Stores that were moved too often or handled carelessly could lose their balance over the weeks ahead. But when each item returned to its place after use, the quiet order of the room helped carry the household through the season. His breathing slowed. The warmth of the hearth and the weight of the meal settled into a comfortable stillness that made movement feel unnecessary. The small tasks of the evening had ended naturally, leaving nothing pressing for his hands to do. Outside, the winter night continued its long silent passage over the land. Inside, the food stores rested undisturbed, and he remained seated beside the hearth, letting the quiet fullness of the modest meal carry him gently into the deeper calm that often followed the evening hours of winter. The quiet beside the hearth lingered for a long time. He remained seated with his back resting lightly against the timber wall. the warmth from the fire moving slowly through the room in soft waves that barely reached the darker corners of the longhouse. The bowl and spoon rested where he had left them on the table. The small dish of barley and crushed herbs sat nearby, its pale kernels dim in the low light. Nothing in the room asked for his attention. The longhouse had entered the quiet portion of the evening when movement naturally became slower. The tasks of the day had already ended, and the few preparations for the coming meal had been set aside for another time. Still, one small habit remained. He leaned forward and rose from the bench again. The motion was steady and unhurried. The warmth of the meal had softened the stiffness in his joints, though the air beyond the hearth still carried enough chill that his hands cooled quickly once they moved away from the fire. He crossed the packed earthen floor toward the storage chest. The chest waited where it had all evening, its dark lid reflecting a faint line of firelight along the grain of the wood. When he reached it, he placed one hand on the lid and lifted it slowly. The hinges answered with their familiar creak. Inside, the bundles rested exactly as he had arranged them earlier. Cloth wrappings pressed gently against one another in neat rows. The pale shapes of preserved fish lay folded beneath the fabric, while the smaller parcels of cured meat filled the remaining spaces along the sides. He did not remove anything. Instead, he adjusted them once more. One bundle near the front shifted slightly when he touched it, leaving a small gap between itself and the one beside it. He nudged it back into place with his fingers so the rows remained tight and orderly. Another piece rested closer to the center than before. He moved it gently toward the corner of the chest where the wood curved inward, allowing the remaining bundles to settle more closely together. These small adjustments took only a moment, yet they gave him a clearer sense of how the stores now rested inside the chest, how much space remained between them, how easily each bundle could be reached when the next meal required it. When he finished, he rested both hands along the edges of the open chest and looked quietly at what remained. The bundles did not appear thin or sparse. There were still enough of them that the chest did not seem empty when opened. Cloth shapes pressed against one another in small orderly ridges across the bottom, but the eye could see the wood beneath them now more easily than it had earlier in the winter. That was the simple truth of the season. Food moved steadily from chest to table, from table to pot, and then into the body that required it to continue through the cold days. The stores were never meant to remain untouched. They were meant to pass slowly through the winter, one careful portion at a time. He lowered the lid again. The wood settled into place with a quiet final sound as the hinges relaxed. For a moment his hand remained on the lid. The surface felt slightly cooler now than when he had first opened it earlier in the evening. The warmth from the hearth did not reach this far along the wall, and the longhouse timber carried the faint chill of the winter air pressing against the outer planks. He turned then and reached upward toward the beam. Several fish still hung there in their quiet rows. Their long-dried bodies had hardened in the autumn winds months earlier, the salt and cold preserving them through the deep weeks of winter. He touched the nearest one lightly. The surface felt firm beneath his fingers, the stiff flesh unchanged since he had last handled it. The twine that held it in place remained tight around the beam, its knot secure. Satisfied, he let the fish rest again against the wood. These small checks had become part of the evening rhythm during winter months, not because anything unusual had happened to the stores, but because the habit of watching them closely helped prevent quiet problems from growing unnoticed. A loose knot might allow a bundle to fall. Damp air might soften a piece of meat if it remained too close to the roof where moisture sometimes gathered. Such things were rare when the room remained dry and steady, but winter always encouraged careful attention. He stepped back from the beam and looked once more across the storage area. The chest remained closed. The hanging fish rested quietly along the rafters. The grain sacks sat undisturbed inside their own chest, where he had returned them earlier. Everything stood ready for the days ahead. There was no urgency in the room, only the steady understanding that the food would continue to move gradually from these quiet places into the evening meals of the coming weeks. He turned and walked back toward the hearth. The glow from the embers brightened slightly as he approached, painting the floor with soft shifting light. The bench waited where he had left it earlier, its wooden surface warmed faintly by the fire. When he sat down again, the longhouse returned to its stillness. Behind him, the storage chests rested securely along the wall. Above them, the preserved fish hung motionless beneath the dark beams, and the quiet care he had taken to arrange and secure the winter food settled gently into the rhythm of the long night now spreading across the land outside. The bench received his weight with a quiet creak. He settled beside the hearth again, the warmth from the embers reaching him before the rest of the room. The fire had lowered while he had been moving about the longhouse. What remained now was mostly a bed of deep red coals, their glow steady and patient beneath a thin skin of ash. They no longer threw much light across the hall. Instead, the glow stayed close to the ground, spreading in a soft circle that warmed the lower beams of the benches and the legs of the table. Above that circle, the long house grew darker, the rafters fading gradually into shadow. He leaned forward and held his hands near the embers. The heat reached his fingers slowly, seeping into the skin that had cooled while he stood near the wall and the storage chests. His palms opened slightly toward the warmth, absorbing what the fire still offered. There was no need to feed it more wood tonight. The embers held enough life to keep the center of the longhouse warm for some time yet. In winter, the fire was rarely allowed to die completely, but it did not need to burn brightly through every hour of the night. A quiet bed of coals could carry warmth much longer than tall flames. He rested his elbows lightly on his knees. For a time, he simply watched the coals. Occasionally, one would settle inward, sending a small glow across the ash before the surface dimmed again. The movement was slow, almost thoughtful, as though the fire itself had entered the calm pace of the evening. Behind him, the long house remained still. The storage chests stood where he had left them. Their lids were closed now, the bundles of food inside resting quietly in their places. Above them, the preserved fish hung along the beams without movement, their shapes barely visible in the dimness. The air carried the faint scent of the evening meal. Grain and salt lingered lightly around the hearth, softened now by the dry smell of wood and ash. The herbs he had crushed earlier still rested among the barley in the small dish on the table, waiting for another pot on another evening. Nothing needed to be done with them now. Winter nights rarely demanded much after the meal was finished. Once the stores had been checked and the tools returned to their places, the longhouse settled into a slower rhythm that belonged to rest rather than work. He drew a slow breath. The warmth of the barley he had eaten earlier remained within him, spreading gently through his body. It softened the cold that sometimes crept into the bones during the long dark hours of winter. Grain did that well. A simple bowl of it, warmed beside the hearth, could carry a man through many quiet hours without hunger returning too quickly. He shifted slightly on the bench, leaning his back against the timber behind him. The wood felt cool through the heavy wool of his clothing, though the warmth of the hearth balanced it enough that the contrast felt comfortable rather than sharp. From this position he could see most of the longhouse interior. The table sat quietly before him with the bowl and spoon resting where he had left them. The small dish of barley and herbs remained nearby. The shadows along the walls were deeper now as the embers gave less light. Farther back, the storage chest appeared only as a dark shape against the timber wall. He did not need to see it clearly to know it remained there. Inside it, the bundles of preserved fish and meat rested exactly where he had arranged them earlier in the evening. Nothing would disturb them during the night. Winter food often spent long hours in stillness like this, prepared months earlier, then waiting quietly between meals while the cold season slowly unfolded beyond the walls. He let his eyes close briefly, not in sleep yet, only in rest. The quiet sounds of the long house remained around him, the slow settling of embers, the faint whisper of air moving through the smoke opening above, the occasional soft shift of timber as the cold outside pressed gently against the structure. None of these sounds required attention. They were simply part of the winter night. When he opened his eyes again, the glow of the hearth had dimmed slightly further. The embers still held their deep red light, though the ash above them had thickened. The warmth remained steady enough that the center of the room felt calm and sheltered despite the long cold night beyond the walls. He leaned forward once more and used a small stick to nudge the coals together. The movement was careful, gathering the embers closer so their heat would remain concentrated through the night. A faint flare of orange appeared briefly where the ash shifted, then settled again into the steady glow. The task required only a few moments. When he finished, he set the stick aside and sat back once more. The long house accepted the quiet arrangement easily. The coals breathed softly, the storage chests remained closed, and the evening settled deeper into the slow, steady calm that always followed the final small tasks of a winter day. The bench received his weight with a quiet creak. He settled beside the hearth again, the warmth from the embers reaching him before the rest of the room. The fire had lowered while he had been moving about the longhouse. What remained now was mostly a bed of deep red coals, their glow steady and patient beneath a thin skin of ash. They no longer threw much light across the hall. Instead, the glow stayed close to the ground, spreading in a soft circle that warmed the lower beams of the benches and the legs of the table. Above that circle, the long house grew darker, the rafters fading gradually into shadow. He leaned forward and held his hands near the embers. The heat reached his fingers slowly, seeping into the skin that had cooled while he stood near the wall and the storage chests. His palms opened slightly toward the warmth, absorbing what the fire still offered. There was no need to feed it more wood tonight. The embers held enough life to keep the center of the longhouse warm for some time yet. In winter, the fire was rarely allowed to die completely, but it did not need to burn brightly through every hour of the night. A quiet bed of coals could carry warmth much longer than tall flames. He rested his elbows lightly on his knees. For a time, he simply watched the coals. Occasionally, one would settle inward, sending a small glow across the ash before the surface dimmed again. The movement was slow, almost thoughtful, as though the fire itself had entered the calm pace of the evening. Behind him, the long house remained still. The storage chests stood where he had left them. Their lids were closed now, the bundles of food inside resting quietly in their places. Above them, the preserved fish hung along the beams without movement, their shapes barely visible in the dimness. The air carried the faint scent of the evening meal. Grain and salt lingered lightly around the hearth, softened now by the dry smell of wood and ash. The herbs he had crushed earlier still rested among the barley in the small dish on the table, waiting for another pot on another evening. Nothing needed to be done with them now. Winter nights rarely demanded much after the meal was finished. Once the stores had been checked and the tools returned to their places, the longhouse settled into a slower rhythm that belonged to rest rather than work. He drew a slow breath. The warmth of the barley he had eaten earlier remained within him, spreading gently through his body. It softened the cold that sometimes crept into the bones during the long dark hours of winter. Grain did that well. A simple bowl of it, warmed beside the hearth, could carry a man through many quiet hours without hunger returning too quickly. He shifted slightly on the bench, leaning his back against the timber behind him. The wood felt cool through the heavy wool of his clothing, though the warmth of the hearth balanced it enough that the contrast felt comfortable rather than sharp. From this position he could see most of the longhouse interior. The table sat quietly before him with the bowl and spoon resting where he had left them. The small dish of barley and herbs remained nearby. The shadows along the walls were deeper now as the embers gave less light. Farther back, the storage chest appeared only as a dark shape against the timber wall. He did not need to see it clearly to know it remained there. Inside it, the bundles of preserved fish and meat rested exactly where he had arranged them earlier in the evening. Nothing would disturb them during the night. Winter food often spent long hours in stillness like this, prepared months earlier, then waiting quietly between meals, while the cold season slowly unfolded beyond the walls. He let his eyes close briefly, not in sleep yet, only in rest. The quiet sounds of the longhouse remained around him, the slow settling of embers, the faint whisper of air moving through the smoke opening above, the occasional soft shift of timber as the cold outside pressed gently against the structure. None of these sounds required attention. They were simply part of the winter night. When he opened his eyes again, the glow of the hearth had dimmed slightly further. The embers still held their deep red light, though the ash above them had thickened. The warmth remained steady enough that the center of the room felt calm and sheltered despite the long cold night beyond the walls. He leaned forward once more and used a small stick to nudge the coals together. The movement was careful, gathering the embers closer so their heat would remain concentrated through the night. A faint flare of orange appeared briefly where the ash shifted, then settled again into the steady glow. The task required only a few moments. When he finished, he set the stick aside and sat back once more. The longhouse accepted the quiet arrangement easily. The coals breathed softly, the storage chests remained closed, and the evening settled deeper into the slow, steady calm that always followed the final small tasks of a winter day. The bench held his weight quietly as the longhouse settled further into the night. He remained seated beside the hearth, leaning back against the timber behind him, the warmth from the gathered coals reaching him in slow, steady breaths. The fire no longer moved with any visible flame. Beneath its pale layer of ash, the embers glowed with a deep, patient red, their heat rising gently into the room without hurry. His hands rested loosely on his knees. The wool of his sleeves had begun to hold some of the warmth from the hearth, and the stiffness that winter air often left in his fingers had softened enough that they no longer sought the fire's edge. His shoulders sank slightly into the wood behind him as the quiet of the evening deepened. Across the room the table remained undisturbed. The bowl and spoon rested upside down where he had left them to dry. The small dish of barley mixed with crushed herbs sat beside them, its pale surface faintly visible in the dim red glow that reached that far. Nothing in that part of the room moved. The grain would remain there until morning, waiting for the next pot to be set beside the hearth. For now it rested as quietly as the bundles inside the storage chest along the wall. His gaze drifted slowly in that direction. In the dimness, the chest appeared only as a low shadow against the timber planks. Its lid remained closed, the iron fittings dark and still. Inside, the cloth-wrapped pieces of preserved food lay where he had arranged them earlier in the evening. They would not be disturbed again tonight. The winter stores had returned to their patient stillness, the same stillness they held through most hours of the season, waiting between the small moments when a hand reached inside and drew one careful portion outward. Above the chest, the shapes along the beam rested without movement. Their outlines had faded into the shadow of the rafters, though he knew exactly where each one hung. The knots that held them had been checked. The twine loops rested firm against the wood. For the long hours ahead, nothing more would change there. He shifted slightly on the bench. The movement was small, more of a settling than a change in position. One foot stretched forward a little farther along the floor before relaxing again. His back pressed more comfortably against the wall as the quiet warmth of the hearth spread gently through the thick wool of his clothing. The air inside the long house had grown calmer. Earlier in the evening, faint currents had moved upward toward the smoke opening above the hearth, carrying the soft traces of cooking grain and salt through the room. Now those scents had thinned and settled, leaving the air dry and steady. The only sound nearby came from the slow breathing of the embers. From time to time, a coal shifted beneath the ash, releasing a deeper glow that briefly brightened the floorboards near the hearth before fading again into its quiet red. He watched it once, then let his eyes rest. Beyond the walls of the longhouse, the winter night continued its long passage over the land. Snow rested heavily across the hills and fields, and the distant shoreline lay silent beneath the dark sky. None of that movement reached the room. Inside, the heavy timbers held the night outside while the small warmth of the hearth gathered quietly in the center of the hall. The bench beneath him had warmed slightly from his presence. The wood no longer carried the sharp cold that it had earlier in the evening when he first sat there beside the fire. He drew a slow breath. The air moved gently through his chest and shoulders before leaving again without sound. With each breath, the body settled a little more deeply into the stillness of the room. The day's small tasks had passed. The evening meal had been prepared and taken. The stores had been checked and returned to their places. Now the longhouse held nothing but the calm rhythm of the winter night. His head lowered slightly, not from sleep yet, but from the quiet heaviness that often arrived when warmth met the deep hours of darkness. The fire continued its patient glow beside him, steady enough that its heat would linger through much of the night. Across the room, the table and chests remained where they had been all evening. The bundles of food rested unseen beneath their cloth wrappings. The grain waited quietly in its dish, and he remained beside the hearth, breathing slowly as the room grew softer around him. Outside, the winter continued without sound. Inside the long house, the embers dimmed little by little, holding their warmth close to the earth while the rest of the room settled gently into the quiet that belonged to the long northern night.